Great. Welcome back to House Healthcare. We are switching gears to H282, which is an act relating to the psychology interjurisdictional compact. So we are going to have Jen do kind of a walkthrough. I don't think we're going to like walk through all the pages like we haven't with the other compacts. And then we'll hear some testimony. So Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So Jennifer Carvey, Legislative Counsel. And do you want me to put the language up, or if we're not going through it page by page, is it easier?
Yeah, I
think if we don't.
Right.
Okay.
So is there there's some document though that you're referencing? What's your notes? Is there anything on our page?
No, I recently took this bill over from another attorney.
So there's an overview. Let's see if that's, yes.
Okay.
So there is an overview, a 5-page overview. Is that what you're doing?
I think that's sort of what I'm using, although it has a fair amount of detail in it.
Okay, so that's under Katie McGlynn on today's page.
Okay.
H282 overview.
That. All right, and I'm realizing if I'm not putting anything up, I do not need to be on. Maybe I'll keep my name on there for a minute. All right. So we are looking at, as the chair said, H282, an act relating to the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact. And there are going to be at least a few revisions that I'm going to suggest when we get to the end. But let's walk through the language that's in here right now. This bill would add a new section, new chapter, although we may actually look at adding a new subchapter instead, on the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact. It starts out with a statement of purpose. It's got some whereas provisions that are sort of like, frame more like a resolution, but kind of like our findings in some legislation. It specifies that the compact applies to telepsychology across state boundaries. And then it goes in sort of two different ways. There's telepsychology, which would be an ongoing ability to practice. And then it also applies to temporary, which it defines as up to 30 days, in-person, face-to-face practice of psychology across state boundaries, but not permanent face-to-face practice. So permanent telepsychology, temporary in-person face-to-face practice, which is maybe a little different from, I don't know how the other ones that have been framed. There are a number of definitions for purposes of the compact. I think the main takeaway ones that I would flag for you to know as we go through this are home state, which is the state in which, where did it go, is the compact state where a psychologist is licensed to practice, so where they actually have a license. If they're licensed in more than one compact state and they're operating under the authorization to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology, so they're doing the telepsychology piece, then the home state is the compact state where the psychologist is physically present when they are delivering those telepsychological services. If the psychologist is licensed in more than one compact state and they're practicing under that temporary authorization to practice, then the home state is the state, any compact state where the psychologist is licensed. So so home state is really where they have the full license, and for telepsychology, that is the state they are in when they are delivering the services. And there's a definition of distant state. So there's distant state and receiving state. And I wanted to flag these a little bit because we sometimes talk about distant site for telehealth, and this is a little bit different from that. So in this compact, the distant state is the compact state where the psychologist is physically present. So not telepsychology, but physically present, providing the temporary in-person face-to-face services. So distant site is when the psychologist not licensed in that state, but is physically present there on a temporary basis, delivering in-person services. Whereas the receiving state is the compact state where the client or patient is physically located when telepsychological services are being delivered. And these terms are used a lot in the compact. That's why I wanted you to understand them. So home state is where the provider is licensed, the psychologist is licensed, and if they're doing telepsychology, it's where they are physically present, regardless of where the patient is. The distant state is where the psychologist has traveled to provide some temporary in-person services allowed under this compact, but they're not licensed there. And the receiving state is the state where the client or patient is when they're receiving telepsychology services from the licensed psychologist.
Gosh. Okay.
Just
Go ahead, Bobby.
just to be super clear, the receiving state only applies to telepsychology.
Yes.
Okay.
Can we get an example?
Can we get an example?
Like, I'm in Vermont, like,
Sure, not remembering what the compact
make it
states
up,
are,
yeah,
but sure. So Vermont licensed psychologists. So let's say Vermont is their home state. They're licensed here and they're physically here and providing services, or typically here. So the distant state would be Vermont licensed provider travels to Colorado and is providing in-person services to a Colorado patient, even though they're not otherwise licensed in Colorado, and they're allowed to do that for up to 30 days. Receiving state can bring your Vermont psychologist back to Vermont, but they are doing telepsychology with a patient who is in Colorado. So they're using some kind of HIPAA compliant Zoom connection or something. And they're delivering services to the patient in that receiving state of Colorado. So Colorado is the distant state if the provider is actually physically present there. It is the receiving state if only the patient or client is there. Does that help?
yeah.
So it's all,
And this is all based on my understanding from reading this. So if there are others who are,
behind you.
I know, if the,
Yeah.
and they're, that's the good part about having them on screen. If they're freaking out, let me know. And,
They all still have a smile on their face, so I think we're okay. Topper, you had a question?
so it depends on where the person is that's getting the service.
yes, but it also depends on where the provider is when they're delivering the service, whether we're talking about a distant state or a receiving state. So if
Okay,
somewhat confusingly, if the provider is in person, then it's a distant state.
yeah,
If the provider is not in person, it is a receiving state.
okay, yeah,
Okay. Let's keep going.
okay.
And very particularly with a compact, I really can't tell you the why, I can tell you the what. So I can tell you what the language says, I can't necessarily tell you why they decided it should say that. All right, so those are some of the most relevant or perhaps most confusing definitions. You will come up with some other ones as well, maybe a couple of other ones to flag because they will come up are, where's that other one? There we go, are the e-passport. The e-passport is a certificate that is issued by the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards that promotes the standardization in the criteria of interjurisdictional telepsychology practice and facilitates the process for licensed psychologists to provide telepsychological services across state lines. Basically, the e-passport is a certificate that's trying to have all the providers providing standardized types of services and processes when using telepsychology across state lines. And the e-passport will become important because it's something that the provider has to have in order to provide telepsychology services. Whereas there is the authority to provide interjurisdictional, trying to find it, authority to provide interjurisdictional, oh no, that's still the telepsychology. The interjurisdictional practice certificate is a certificate issued by that same Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards that grants temporary authority to practice based on notification to the State Psychology Regulatory Authority of the intention to practice temporarily and verification of one's qualifications for such practice. So these terms come up in the context of telepsychology and the remote, what is it, interjurisdictional temporary in-person services.
Jen?
Yes.
Did they, it only relates to the compact states though, right? Or is this,
Right.
so it's still, we're in the compact?
We're still, yes, this is all about the compact states. It is my understanding from Katie's notes that there are 35 states that are in the compact, so it's a majority of the states. Okay, so now
Do you think we need to put that in the definition? Because when you read it,
well, it talks a lot about compact, doing things in compact states. It defines compact state.
okay, all right.
There are a lot of definitions. I'm just flagging a few of them for you. There are 29 definitions.
We're not doing all of them, right?
No.
Okay.
Just plucking out a few
I have to add a lot more time.
no, I was frankly pulling out the few that it took me a bit to wrap my head around, so I thought it would be good for you to know them before we.
Thank you.
Give us the 5-second thing of it, that's good.
Right.
All right. So that's section 30, in the bill, section 3052. And I will just pause here to say, one of the things that needs to happen is that we need to move where in statute this is proposing to be, because it's actually proposing to use numbers that are already taken up by your telehealth registration and licensure.
Okay. Okay.
So I will be proposing to move where this is in statute, so don't get too attached to the section numbers. But for now, section 3053 is home state licensure. And as I said, the home state is where the psychologist is licensed to practice psychology. The compact allows the psychologist to hold one or more compact state licenses at a time. So you can have more than one, you can be licensed in more than one compact state, but this is where that idea of the home state being the compact state where the psychologist is physically present when the services are delivered, if they're using telepsychology. And any compact state can require that a psychologist obtain or retain a license to be authorized to practice in the compact state under circumstances not otherwise authorized by the temporary licensure to practice. Home state's license authorizes the psychologist to practice in a receiving state under that authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology only if the state has certain mechanisms in place. So if they only if they require the psychologist to hold an active e-passport, they have a mechanism for receiving and investigating complaints about licensed individuals. They notify the commission if there is any adverse action, which is a defined term, or significant investigatory information regarding a licensed individual. They require the identity history summary of all applicants at initial licensure, including using the results of fingerprints or other biometric data within 10 years after activation of the compact. And they comply with the bylaws and rules of the Compact Commission. So that's the telepsychology authorization. The home state's license grants temporary authorization to practice to a psychologist in a distant state. So this is the in-person piece, only if the home state currently requires the psychologist to hold an active interjurisdictional practice certification. That was one of those defined terms. Has a mechanism for receiving and investigating complaints about licensed individuals, notifies that these are really the same provisions except for the e-passport and the versus the IPC. So we won't go through all of those, but has certain regulatory processes in place. Section 3054, now we're focusing specifically on the compact privilege to practice telepsychology. The compact requires that compact states recognize the right of a psychologist licensed in a compact state to practice telepsychology. In other compact states where the psychologist is not licensed, under that authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology. To exercise the authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology, a licensed psychologist in a compact state must hold a graduate degree in psychology from an institute of higher education that meets certain criteria that are specified in the compact. This says process, but really possess a current, full, unrestricted license to practice. Have no history of adverse action that violates commission rules. Have no criminal record history reported on an identity history summary that violates commission rules. Possess a current active e-passport and provide attestations with regard to areas of intended practice, conformity with standards of practice, competence in telepsychology technology, criminal background, and knowledge and adherence to legal requirements in the home and receiving states. The home state for telepsychology maintains authority over the license of any psychologist practicing into a receiving state under this authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology. A psychologist practicing in a receiving state under this authority is subject to the receiving state's scope of practice, and the receiving state can limit or revoke a psychologist's authority to practice telepsychology there and take other necessary actions under the receiving state's laws. And if a receiving state takes action, they have to notify the home state, so home state for our purposes, Vermont, and the Compact Commission. And an e-passport is revoked and a psychologist is not eligible to practice telepsychology in a compact state under this compact authority if the psychologist's license in any home state, another compact state, or their authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology in a receiving state is restricted, suspended, or limited. So that's in the context of the privilege to practice telepsychology. Section 3055 in the existing language is the compact's temporary authorization to practice. So this is the temporary in-person piece. Compact states are required to recognize the right of psychologists to practice temporarily in other compact states where they are not licensed, as long as they are licensed in a compact state. It provides requirements for the temporary authorization to practice for a psychologist licensed to practice in a compact state. It requires the psychologist practicing in a distant state under the temporary authorization to do so within the scope of practice authorized by that distant state. And a psychologist practicing into a distant state under the temporary authorization to practice is subject to the distant state, so the state they are physically present in, the distant state's authority and law. And this allows a distant state to limit or revoke the temporary authorization to practice and to take action under the distant state's laws, and requires the distant state to notify the home state and the Compact Commission if they take such action. And if a psychologist's license, again, in any home state, another compact state, or their temporary authorization to practice in any distant state is restricted, suspended, or otherwise limited, then their interjurisdictional practice certification is revoked, and the psychologist will not be eligible to practice in a compact state under that temporary authorization to practice. So a lot of parallels here, but some key differences between the telepsychology piece and the temporary authorization piece. Section 3056 in the bill as introduced deals with conditions of telepsychology practice in a receiving state. And this allows a psychologist to practice in a receiving state under this authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology only in the performance of the scope of practice for psychology that as assigned by an appropriate state psychology regulatory authority as defined by the commission's rules, and under two circumstances. The psychologist initiates the contact with the client or patient in the home state using telecommunication technologies with a client or patient in the receiving state. And then they comply with other conditions regarding telepsychology as determined by the rules of the commission. Section 3057 deals with adverse actions, which I know is always a big issue in compacts. So the compact allows or gives a home state the power to impose adverse action against a psychologist's license issued by the home state, and allows the distant state to have the authority to take adverse action on a psychologist's temporary authorization to practice in that distant state. A receiving state can take adverse action on a psychologist's authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology within that receiving state. And a home state may take adverse action against a psychologist based on an adverse action taken by the distant state regarding temporary in-person face-to-face practice. So here's an important piece. That's the one I starred in my notes. So if a home state takes adverse action, that psychologist's authority to practice interjurisdictional technology is terminated and the e-passport is revoked, as well as termination of temporary authorization to practice and revocation of the interjurisdictional practice certificate. So if the home state takes adverse action, you're done. A home state's regulatory authority shall investigate and take appropriate action regarding reported inappropriate conduct engaged in by a licensee in a receiving state, the same way it would if the conduct occurred in home state and the home state's law controls. But a distant state's psychology regulatory authority will investigate and take appropriate action related to inappropriate conduct by a psychologist practicing under a temporary authority to practice that occurred in the distant state as if the conduct occurred. I want to check this one actually, because it says as if it occurred in the home state. Yes, it does say that and so this one doesn't make sense to me, so I'm gonna
Come back.
look into it a little bit. It is what it says in the bill, but it says a distant state psychology regulatory authority will investigate and take action that occurred in the distant state as it would if the conduct had occurred by a licensee in the home state. I'm not sure what that would look like.
Okay.
And it says in those cases, the distant state's law would control in determining any adverse action against their authorization. So I had that one flagged in my actual bill. Section 3058 deals with additional authorities invested in the compact state's psychology regulatory authority. So this says, in addition to any other powers granted under state law, a compact state's psychology regulatory authority has the authority to issue subpoenas, issue cease and desist orders and injunctive relief orders, or both, to revoke the psychologist's authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology under the temporary authorization to practice, but I think those may be two different things. The psychologist cannot change their home state during an investigation. They can only change it once the investigation is complete. And the home state's regulatory authority is authorized to complete any pending investigations of a psychologist, to take appropriate actions, and to report the conclusion of investigations to the commission. Section 3059 deals with the coordinated licensure information system, requires the Compact Commission to provide for the development and maintenance of a coordinated licensure information system, also referred to as a coordinated database, and reporting system containing licensure and disciplinary action information on all psychologists, individuals to whom this compact applies in all states. Notwithstanding any provision of state law to the contrary, it requires, a compact state to submit a uniform data set to the coordinated database on all licensees with specified information pursuant to the rules. Requires the administrator of the coordinated database to notify all compact states of any adverse actions taken or significant investigative information on any licensee in a compact state. Says that compact states that are reporting information to the coordinated database may designate information that may not be shared with the public without the express permission of the reporting compact state. And information that is submitted to the database that later needs to be expunged in accordance with state law shall be removed from the database. Section 3060 is the establishment of the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact Commission. So this is the kind of the regulatory authority. It's a joint public agency. It consists of one voting representative from each compact state who serves as their commissioner. And it specifies that it is appointed by the state's Psychology Regulatory Authority, so in our case, OPR. The commission has to meet at least once each calendar year. The meetings are open to the public except in certain circumstances. By a majority vote of the commissioners, the commission can adopt rules and bylaws to govern its conduct and carry out the purposes of the compact. The commission has all kinds of authority, both to promulgate rules to facilitate and coordinate implementation and administration of the compact, but also to do a whole bunch of things I don't need to go into unless you want me to, about just sort of running a commission. It establishes an executive committee of 6 members, and it specifies their authority. It establishes procedures for financing the commission, and it says the commission can collect an annual assessment from compact states or impose fees on other parties to fund its work. And it establishes provisions for the qualified immunity and defense of members, employees, and others involved with the commission. It has rulemaking provisions for the commission. Rules and amendments to rules are binding on member states, but if a majority of the compact states' legislatures reject a rule, then the rule is not in effect. So that's how you can undo a rule. And it provides a process for notice, hearings, and adoption of rules. There are procedures around oversight, dispute resolution, and enforcement. Each compact state is required to enforce the compact, and there are remedial, termination, and enforcement processes if the commission finds that a compact state has defaulted on its obligations or responsibilities under the compact or compact rules. The date of implementation, the compact was to take effect when the 7th state joined. As I said, there are 35 states, so it is in effect. Compact state can withdraw from the compact by repealing the enabling legislation. Withdrawal takes effect 6 months after enactment of the repealing statute. And the compact does not prevent cooperative arrangements between a compact and non-compact state as long as there's no conflict with the compact. Finally, the compact is to be construed liberally, and if it is contrary to any state constitution, it will still remain in full force and effect for the remaining compact states. And this bill would take effect on July 1st. So I mentioned a couple of things. I think you need to add a specific section in actually enacting or adopting the compact, which I think may be in some of your others, and I know has been in the compacts that I've worked on. So this enacts the legislation, which sort of arguably enacts it, but I think it would be better to have something that specifically has Vermont enacting and adopting. Okay. So that we would sort of affirmatively be saying we're a member state now. And there's some drafting anomalies that don't fit with our statutes, or that otherwise seem to potentially be errors. I did not find an actual model legislation. I just found links to all of the states that have enacted the legislation. So I've been looking at some of those. And I know at least in some of them, some of the issues that I found they have addressed in a way that I think is preferable. So I'm working on a strike all amendment for you. I'm partway through it, and I'll keep working on it while you hear from others.
Okay, wonderful.
So there you go. That's everything I know about the compact.
I'm going to say we not ask questions right now. Let's hear from everyone else because the language is the language. So let's hear from everyone on, and then we can always have Jen come back and we will have Jen come back. So we will turn to Lauren Lehman, staff attorney with OPR. Welcome back. It's been a while, but you're here quite often.
Mostly on compacts.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So Lauren Lehman, I'm general counsel over at OPR, and I'm here today to discuss compacts with you, SIPACT in particular. So SIPACT, as we've just heard from Jen, is a little bit different from the other compacts considered by the committee this year so far, in that it's more limited. Both in the scope of practice it authorizes in other states, as well as who's authorized to practice or to obtain a license, a compact license under this compact. I'll start. It was developed by the Council on State Governments, which is a generator of many of the compacts this committee's considered this session. My number of states differs slightly from Jen's. My understanding is there's 34 states who've adopted it and have implemented it, and there are 2 states that are currently have adopted it, and one is effective at the end of this month, and that's Michigan, and then Rhode Island becomes effective and on July 1st of this year. So there's 36 states, and I should say that New England, New Hampshire, and Maine have adopted and implemented this. So we do have some close neighbors that have this SIPACT in effect right now. Features, it's a more complex compact than the other ones. In addition to obtaining the home state license, as Jen mentioned, there's 2 pathways to go. So if you want to, and you can go both ways if you want, but they're both have separate requirements. One is the telepsychology route, and that is you first obtain this e-passport from the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB, and that e-passport costs $400, and that's in addition to your state home license. You get that $400 e-passport, and then in addition to that, you need to get the authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology from the Compact Commission. And that's an additional $100. I'm sorry, that's an additional $40. So, and both of those need to be renewed annually. The annual cost for the e-passports $100, and the annual renewal cost for the authority to practice interjurisdictional psychology is $20. So initial cost of $440 in addition to your home license, plus $120 every year to maintain it. And that authority, that allows you to practice telepsychology in other states. The other pathway is temporary practice in another state, and that authorizes a holder of that compact license to practice for up to 30 days a year in another compact state. That is an initial fee of $200. You pay the ASPPB again, $200 for an interjurisdictional practice certificate. And then you have to pay an additional $40 to the compact for a temporary authorization to practice in that state. Again, those need to be renewed annually. So $240 startup, and then annually it's a $50 fee for that ASPPB license and a $20 fee for the compact license. So it's a $70 fee annually to maintain that. So it's got several layers of licensure required to, and then unlike other compacts, once you've obtained those licenses, you're not allowed to practice in that state fully. You are allowed to either do telepsychology or you can do the temporary practice in that other state. So the other component is the eligibility. So to be eligible for either pathway under SIPACT, it doesn't say it in the compact language, the model legislation or the legislation proposed, but in the rules promulgated by the commission, it has required that it is only available to doctoral level psychologists. Vermont has a master's level psychology license, and folks who have that license are eligible and able to practice to the same scope of practice as doctoral level licensure. But we are one of 2 states that allow that. So in this multi-state agreement, interstate agreement, it's only doctoral level licensees that are allowed to participate in SIPACT. Additionally, to be eligible to practice under SIPACT, you need to have graduated from a degree program that was accredited by the American Psychological Association. And that, again, under Vermont law, that we have a pathway to licensure that allows folks who graduated from a non-APA accredited program to obtain licenses and practice at the same scope under state law. But to be eligible for the SIPACT license, the individual would had to have graduated from a APA accredited institution. So those are two further limitations in what we have right now. OPR, just like with other compacts, really appreciates and supports the mobility that SciPact would offer, particularly in the area of telepsychology. You know, we've talked through telehealth. This committee's considered a lot that we can facilitate in our own state, letting out-of-state practitioners come here. SciPact would allow those practitioners to follow their patients out of state as well, which is something we can't do through state law. So that's a great bonus for compacts and for SciPact. And it allows up to 30 days of in-person care as well. And it has less of an impact, likely it will have less of an impact on access and the number of in-state licensees, both because folks will have limited practice that they can engage in. They can't just go to another state and open a full brick and mortar practice. So it'll have less of an impact on the number of Vermont licensees, we anticipate. And just allowing patients and clients to be followed by the provider, it helps with continuity of care. College students going home on the weekends, snowbirds going south for the winter, the psychologist who's in Vermont can follow that patient continuously via telepsychology during that period of time. Do have concerns about it. We've talked to the Board of Psychological Examiners, which works with our office and is made up of psychologists practicing in the state, as well as a couple of public members. And the concern that they've expressed some similar concerns to us, one of which is they're generally supportive of it, but they're concerned about crisis care, and they were concerned about this through telehealth as well, that if you're talking to somebody who's located in another state, or you have an out-of-state professional talking to somebody in Vermont, they might not be as aware about the crisis care resources on the ground in that location. And so if they're talking to a patient who is in crisis, there's a challenge there. I think it could be addressed through having an expectation of the provider of standards of care and standards of practice, that you familiarize yourself with those resources. If you have a patient in that location, that expectation could be met and established. I think the other concern we have is the limited scope of who's eligible. The state has so far kept our master's level licensees pretty equivalent to our doctoral level licensees in terms of scope of practice, and this would be a step toward distinguishing between those license types. Similarly, we don't distinguish between licensees who've graduated from APA accredited institutions and non-APA accredited institutions, and that is a distinction made under SciPact. We've talked about reciprocal discipline before. Jen touched on this as well, that there's an obligation if somebody's disciplined in their home state for providing that all other states have to remove that individual's license as well if they're practicing in the state. So Vermont would need to prevent somebody who is disciplined in their home state from practicing in Vermont. They don't hold a privilege in Vermont or a license in Vermont, so we wouldn't necessarily have to prosecute them to remove that authority. They just would no longer be allowed to practice here because the ASPPB and the commission would withdraw that privilege. It wouldn't be Vermont withdrawing that privilege. So there's less concern about us prosecuting under that, but there's still a policy concern about those individuals disciplined under another state's law for providing gender affirming care, for example. Then Vermont encourages that and supports gender affirming care and treatment. And so having somebody disciplined and removed from the compact in another home state and therefore prevented from providing that care in Vermont could possibly be a consequence of that provision. And unlike other ones, while we see less of an impact on the number of licensees. In Vermont, we still aren't able to charge a home state fee for this license. So there's a potential for revenue impacts for licensees. But generally, OPR supports the goals and the policy underlying this the other compacts that the committee has considered this session.
Great, thank you. I think what we're going to do is just hold questions and hear from our other two witnesses. So Dr. Marissa Coleman, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Marissa Coleman. I'm testifying on behalf of the University of Vermont Health Network. I'm currently a clinical psychologist at the doctoral level and vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Vermont Medical Center. I've been employed here for 4.5 years and practicing as a psychologist in Vermont for 5.5. Vermont is facing a mental health access crisis. In order to properly support the mental health needs of Vermont residents, we need to think innovatively and utilize all of the tools available to us. The Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, SIPACT, is an interstate agreement, as we've discussed, designed to facilitate the practice of telepsychology and temporary in-person, face-to-face practice of psychology across state borders. The mutual recognition model allows a practitioner to practice in the compact member states, either using a multi-state license or by obtaining a compact privilege, again, as we went over, and compact authorization. SIPACT is available to doctoral level licensed psychologists, as mentioned, and as of January 1st, 2023, there are 34 SIPACT participating states. I strongly believe that if Vermont becomes a SIPACT state, we will see an abundance of teletherapy options for Vermont residents. Notably, this will allow Vermont residents to access specialized mental health care that may not be currently available in Vermont. For example, increased access to shorter wait times for psychological assessments, culturally humble care, and pediatric and family therapy are among the services that are particularly difficult for Vermont residents to access at this time. It is clear that the lack of access to mental health services disproportionately impacts our most vulnerable populations: children, people of color, and people with disabilities, to name a few. Increasing mental health access across state lines will positively impact the buildup of people with psychiatric needs in our emergency departments. Preventative psychotherapeutic supports directly impact the health and well-being of our state, psychiatric access challenges, and ability to equitably serve our most vulnerable people. As a bilingual clinical psychologist, I often struggle with finding appropriate referral sources for our English language learner individuals who contact me for therapeutic care. SIPACT would enable ELL individuals to seek psychotherapeutic care in their primary language. I urge the House Health Care Committee to carefully consider supporting SIPACT legislation in Vermont. I can also speak about, from the perspective of a psychologist that holds multiple licenses. I moved to Vermont from the state of Georgia. I maintained that license to practice in Georgia and have supported some patients there through teletherapy in order to continue to support their continuity of care. Oftentimes in Vermont, as a practicing psychologist, I'm contacted, whether it be through private practice or in my role at the University of Vermont Medical Center, by patients and residents of color looking for not only a provider that can provide culturally humble, multicultural psychology services, but also a provider that they feel may represent an identity that they also hold. We see this a lot also within our LGBTQ plus population, and weekly I'm at a loss for where to refer these patients. Currently, I could count on one hand the number of psychologists that identify as a person of color and specifically a Black provider in the state of Vermont. Yet there are increasing numbers of BIPOC residents in Vermont, whether they be new American, refugees, or have been born in this country, that are looking for psychotherapeutic support, particularly to address racialized trauma that they experienced, whether living here or throughout their other lived experiences. And so it's incredibly valuable to have a provider, practitioner that holds a similar identity, but also has been trained to provide the culturally humble care. I'm hopeful and confident that Vermont's therapists and providers that are here are increasing their skill set in that area. And as it compared to other states within our country, we still have a long way to go. So I'll pause my testimony there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And if you can stay with us, we're going to turn to Marlene Marin. I may not have said that correct. I'm sorry. You're on mute. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair Houghton and members of the committee for the invitation to be able to testify today. I am Marlene Marin. I'm the Chief Psychologist in the Department of Psychological Services at the University of Vermont Medical Center. I've been practicing in Vermont for over 32 years and almost 27 here at the hospital as both a generalist serving people across a lifespan and with a specialty in medical psychology. I'm here as a licensed practicing psychologist and on behalf of the UVM Health Network to express our organization's support for H282. You've heard from Dr. Marissa Coleman, so I really do want to echo her attention to the dearth of mental health providers in the region we serve, particularly for BIPOC and non-native English speakers. Joining SIPACT would help Vermont providers and patients benefit from greater access to trauma-informed care across our region, and be able to spread the reach of Vermont psychologists with such expertise would be really important. At least the network, and I'm sure other providers in the area, we serve people from Vermont, New York, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and individuals from other states who become ill or injured while they're here. SIPACT membership would help us to serve patients who enter our hospital system and to maintain treatment with them when they're no longer in Vermont. It would also allow us to help Vermonters who leave the state, this was already mentioned, for vacation, school, college, tending to family needs in other states, or who now work in a hybrid way where they are having their insurance benefits and their home state is here in Vermont, but they live in different places throughout the year. This is really particularly germane for young people who struggle with gender and developmentally related transitions. It's really hard for them to form a new treatment relationship with somebody, especially if they're only going to be in the other state for a brief period of time. So currently, if our patients leave the state, psychologists can only provide telehealth services to them if they're licensed in each state where the patient is physically located. I actually have temporary licenses in North Carolina, Florida, New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, just to be able to maintain support to patients who are temporarily out of state or have moved or are in transition. To be able to maintain a treatment relationship for highly vulnerable young people, especially when they go off to college or leave for work, would be clinically beneficial. And it would also help patients make use of their Vermont-based health insurance, including Medicaid, by continuing with their Vermont psychologist. Vermont providers would have a greater capacity to build practices and thrive in Vermont and contribute to our economy by serving Vermonters wherever they may be, as well as those who require specialized expertise that we offer. COVID has taught us that telehealth is a highly valuable platform for providing essential mental health care to people who might not otherwise be able to present for in-person care. This has been especially critical for our patients with cancer, cystic fibrosis, and other medical conditions which require them to be out of state for stem cell, lung, or other organ transplants, or specialized mental health treatment, like eating disorder care. Vermont residents with acute and chronic life-threatening illnesses sometimes need to be out of state for their medical care for extended periods of time. Inclusion in SIPACT would enable us to continue to provide support to them while they are out of state, wherever appropriate. In sum, SIPACT participation would help us to increase psychological service capacity in a region desperately in need of resources. On behalf of my colleagues at the UVM Health Network, I urge you to pass H282. Thank you for your consideration.
Great, thank you all. So I'm going to have to step out. So our esteemed vice chair is going to field questions. And then this is also on the agenda for tomorrow for us to have a committee discussion and potential vote. And we can also talk about, we'll be back afternoon too. So I'm going to turn it over to
Your esteemed
my
vice chair.
esteemed vice chair to handle questions. And thank you all for being here.
Okay, questions? Sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
Leslie,
Leslie, excuse me.
sometimes it's Linda. I'm just wondering, does this seem more complex than the other ones? Or not necessarily? Or is it just,
We're more complex.
it seems, it's,
To me personally, it sounds confusing.
yeah, I mean, and that's what well, I guess I should look over there. I'm just wondering, why, is it more complex or am I misunderstanding it? And if it is, and I know, Jen, you said not the why, and I get that, but can we get help? Can I get help with that?
Yeah, so I see Lauren has her hand up, so I'm just I will say for my purposes, I didn't work on your other ones, but I've worked on other compacts. It seems to me, I think because of the different tracks, a bit more confusing, but I see others now with hands up who can probably give you more information and may be able to tell you why. Not that they were.
I can't leave a name up there.
Oh, it's Marlene Marin.
Go ahead, Molly.
Thank you. I think the language is confusing, but the process and mechanism are not. So, I mean, if we just think about it as this is just a way to allow a regulated, clear pathway for psychologists in Vermont to continue to provide or to begin to provide services to patients wherever they are. The language allows it to be very carefully structured to make sure that we meet all the eligible criteria and that there's a mechanism for Vermont to regulate, discipline, and manage our efforts the same way they would right here. Now it's just making sure we're responsible for those aspects wherever, is it Vermont? Is it the receiving state? And so the language, it's cumbersome, but it's, I think, really helpful to just determine who's responsible for which piece of policy and regulation. But the actual practice mechanics are really fairly simple, and they're already happening. It's just that in order to happen, we're having to hold multiple licenses or make multiple agreements or temporary agreements with different states for this to happen at this time.
Thank you. Lauren, you have, Laura?
I agree with Dr. Marin for the most part. It is more complex to your question than the other compacts. I think it was one of the earlier compacts. And also each profession is pretty unique in what they're comfortable with in terms of trust and delegation to a centralized commission in other states. So this was what was agreed to there. The licensing structure of having the home state license plus that ASPPB intermediate license plus a compact license for both forms of practice is complicated and more so than other states. However, as Dr. Marin said, it's really up to the provider who can choose to navigate that. Yes, it's complex, and it is on the provider though to navigate that rather than the policy or the state to set in place rules or regulations to navigate it.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
So Lauren, I know that there's a medical compact, but I never looked at it because it was before my time. How does I'm thinking about harm, where harm can occur. Is the medical compact similar to this or simpler, or how does it compare? Or is that ridiculous? It could be ridiculous.
It's a different form. It allows for abbreviated licensure applications in another state. So you still have to apply in that state where you want to practice and it's an abbreviated license type. So it's a little different. The other ones you've considered this session work on a privilege to practice mechanism where you the person has to obtain a home state license and then applies to the compact for a license. And through applying to the compact, they say, I want to work in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. And then the compact collects fees from Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and tells Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine that person's coming to practice there. This compact, the nurse licensure compact, is another model. And this compact is yet another model where there's an intermediary between the state and the commission compact or the compact commission. the ASPPB, which is a National Regulatory Association, and they help ensure that whoever is coming for that commission privilege is qualified for that privilege. And they do that by issuing a intermediate credential, the e-passport or the interjurisdictional. I can't remember the other one for temporary practice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm good.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for all of you coming today. You're a big help. Thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.